This title might seem a little bit hyperbolic. Anywhere you look in the world of fantasy, new or old, you're gonna find dragons. Nevertheless, with the books that I have here, it does feel like dragons are taking over fantasy, because these are some of the most exciting fantasy novels to come out in recent years. I spend a lot of my time these days not reading fantasy as much as I used to. Fantasy used to be my entire world. And now I read a lot of international literature and translation, a lot of literary fiction, and I don't have that much time for fantasy. And that's kind of made me sad. And so I thought I need to spend a little bit more time catching up on what I've missed. And what I've missed is some of the best fantasy ever written. One of the two novels that I'm going to talk about here today is perhaps the greatest fantasy novel written in 10 plus years. Is that hyperbolic? I don't really care. So what I'm going to talk about today is two fantasy novels. Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon and The Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter. When I said that one of these two books is one of the best fantasy novels written in the last decade or so, I really did mean The Priory of the Orange Tree. And that kind of begins right here with the cover and the title of this book. The Priory of the Orange Tree is an incredible name. When you consider the fact that right from the get-go you're clearly supposed to focus on the fact that this is a book about dragons, and yet Priory, Orange Tree, these things do not scream dragon, and that adds a little sense of intrigue and mystery to the affair. What the hell is the Priory of the Orange Tree? Well, at the time of recording I'm about 300 pages into this 800-page standalone fantasy novel, and I don't yet entirely know what the Priory is. And that's pretty exciting. It's also just a beautiful name. It's evocative of specific imagery. I find it tantalizing and beautiful. And you couple that with the fact that this cover is astonishingly beautiful. It is shiny, it has a gorgeous mix of colors. Blue and red and orange together are stellar. And then you've got the dragon, the tower, and the town. It's all so stunning. The cover design of this is really outstanding. So what's it about? First, I should address why this is one of the great fantasy books of our time. It's probably fair to say that if you look back on era-defining, genre-defining fantasy novels, there are two names that stand above all others, on the shoulders of all the other writers. They're not my personal favorites, but you cannot disagree with the fact that they are the greats. And perhaps that's because they've been made into the two biggest fantasy film and TV properties ever made. One is Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and the other is George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire. And this book, The Priory of the Orange Tree, it carries elements of both of those series. And that alone makes it something worth reading, worth paying attention to. Like Game of Thrones, this is a book that follows a colourful cast of wildly varied protagonists who are all in different places around this vast and detailed world. So there's a lot to keep track of. In the Song of Ice and Fire books, every chapter is named after the character that is focused on within that chapter. In this, every chapter is simply named East or West, or after a while, when you get a bit further in, South, and maybe beyond that, because I haven't finished the book. And within the East and the West, you have specific characters that it will focus on. So when it says West, you know there's two characters that it might focus on. East, same deal. So like Game of Thrones, it has a sprawling world with a lot of moving pieces. It's kind of like looking at a chessboard and trying to keep track of where your pieces are and what they're up to and what their next move will be. And in that sense, it feels very Song of Ice and Fire, very Game of Thrones. Like Lord of the Rings, it is a book that excels at world building, lore, and language. It is full of character names and place names that are really hard to pronounce, and it is a world of deep, detailed lore. The best thing about the lore in this is that it is so rich in detail without being convoluted, and I think people get these two things confused. You can have a world where the lore and the history and the background of it is very, very rich and detailed without it being too confusing or convoluted. I think as soon as you start to introduce too many disparate elements that don't really work together for the sake of complexity, you've got something that's pretty much worthless. Whereas if you focus on revitalizing reliable tropes and themes, or character types, world types, but you make sure that those things are so richly detailed and dimensionalized, then you've got a winning formula here, and there is a winning formula in Priory of the Orange Tree. Now, What's it about? Like I said, the setting, the lore, the world building, the history of this book is deep and it is rich, but it is not difficult to follow and keep track of. And that is thanks to Samantha Shannon being a master class of a writer. She is confident in every line, every word that she puts down on paper, and she knows exactly how to keep you entertained and keep you focused without guiding you down a useless path. You're never really lost in this world, although at the beginning you might feel overwhelmed. The book begins in the East with a character called Tane. Tane finds a man washed up on the beach of her island, and this man has arrived there from the west, and that's all we know. We know that there is some sort of a plague that people worry about infecting the island, and the man might be infected in some way, and she has to decide if she is going to report him to the authorities, kick up a fuss, or pretty much pass him on to someone else to deal with. And she ends up deciding to do that only because the next day is an exam that she wants to take, and if she disrupts the whole system of their town by warning people that there is some potential plague-carrying man washed up on shore, then her exam will be cancelled, and so she's kind of guarding her future. And so immediately we have a very interesting young character that we want to follow, we've got a personality that we're invested in, and we've got ethics and morals being wrestled with a little bit. So straight off the bat, we've got an interesting character who has a very, very cemented personality that has room to grow, while also having a strange and intriguing plot. Who is this man? Why is he on the island? Where did he come from? What does he want? And that's just the first few pages of an 800-page novel. This island in the East is vaguely Japan-inspired. A lot of the names of people and places have a sense of the Japanese in terms of how the words are structured. For example, Tane, her name is not Tane, it is Tane. At the beginning of the book, she does mention that Samantha Shannon took emphasis from lots of different folklores and mythologies all around the world. And as you read, you do get a sense that the East is very Japan-inspired, while the West is very British fantasy-inspired. I like that. Tane is not the only character in the East. The other main character of this island is a Western man who lives on the island, whose name is Niklaus Roos. I don't know if I'm ever saying the names of Western characters right, because they are pretty ridiculous in a fun way. Niklaus sounds like Nicholas. Roos, I'm not sure. Doesn't really matter, but it was a bit of a headache at first because I'm someone who has an internal voice in my head when I read, and every time I read a name, I like to make sure I know how I pronounce it, as if I was reading it out loud. That's what kind of a reader I am. Not everyone is that kind of a reader. Might not bother you. Bothered me. I really wanted to know how to pronounce these names. Niklaus Roos is an interesting guy. He's the first very clearly queer character that we meet. This book is full of queer characters. Niklaus had a former male lover. He is a former alchemist who has been banished to this island in the East because of alchemical practices and broken promises that he made in the West. That's all I'll say about him for now. He's a desperately interesting character as well, and he's been banished to this island for a long, long time, and he is now in charge of this man who has been washed up on shore. In the West, we have a very, very British fantasy, Tolkien, Arthurian legend inspired kind of a world. You have a matriarchal queendom that is ruled by Queen Sabran the Ninth. Queen Sabran is the latest in a line of matriarchs. Every queen takes a king, and every king provides her with the seed to create a daughter, and it is always a daughter. So they treat this as though it is fate. There is always a girl who is next in line. She always becomes the queen. It is a tradition that seems to be tangled up with destiny. This is a country, a place that is obsessed with its history and its tradition and its fate and its duty to uphold certain traditions and certain forms. And the most important one is a prophecy. Many, many countless years ago, there was a war between the people and dragons. Here's where dragons come in. The dragons come from, so the prophecy says, the core of the earth, and they will return for some kind of a war, and the queens continuing to be queens and sire queens is what keeps everything moving and ticking along nicely. And so dragons and the story of dragons and the lore is a really, really big part of the world building in this place. Queen Sabran is not actually a protagonist as such. She's always kind of in the background. Her story is being told by a more focal character who is our main protagonist of the West, and her name is spelled E-A-D, and I take that to be Ayad, only because otherwise I'm going to pronounce it Eid, and Eid doesn't sound quite right for a character. I mean, just because I have a D&D character called Mrs. Christmas doesn't mean that everyone names their characters after a religious holiday. Not everyone is as weird as I am, so I'm going to say it's Ayad. Ayad is fascinating. She works, I can't remember the name of her position, she works in Queen Sabran's court, she's very close to the Queen, and the two of them are getting closer, but Ayad comes from whatever the Priory of the Orange Tree is, which we don't know at the beginning. And she's kind of been sent to keep an eye on the Queen, which is what she does. Ayad at the beginning is killing intruders who keep sneaking into the Queen's chambers to try to kill her. That's pretty much all I'm going to say about Sabran and Ayad, because their journey together, their relationship, their story is absolutely fascinating. But one thing that is very interesting is there is a moment early in the book where all of the other women of the Queen's chamber are talking about the traditions of their religion and their beliefs in terms of the dragons and the people that vanquished the dragons back in the past. And because Ayad is from the outside of Enis, from the Priory of the Orange Tree, she actually serves someone different. She has a slightly different twist on the religion. It kind of reminds you of the difference between Catholics and Protestants, or the difference between the Torah and the Bible. There are fascinating links between what Ayad and the other women believe and the differences between what they believe and how they are different. I think that was really, really cleverly done, and it's a sign of how well thought out the religion, the lore, the mythology of this world is. I've kind of lost track of what I've been saying because I've been on this enormous spiral talking about how wonderful these characters are. I hope I didn't give anything away. Also, in the east, Tane is a dragon rider. This is a quite interesting thing about the book. This is the last thing I'll say. The West are scared of the rise of dragons. Dragons returning to wreak havoc on the world. In the east, they have dragons. Different dragons. A different breed of dragon who are born of the ocean, of the water. And they fly and people ride them. They have dragon riders. Tane, as I mentioned, she is one of them. The exam that she wants to take is to become a dragon rider. To become a knight of this realm, if you like. And she will need to bond with a dragon and become sisters of sorts with this dragon, so they have a very different relationship. So yeah, the book really does focus on dragons, but it's fascinating to see how in the West, dragons are monstrous, evil, terrifying things that will rule the world and take over and destroy everything. In the East, they are friends. It kind of reminds me of the Live Ships in The Live Ship Traders by Robin Hobb, if you've read that, how the ships can speak and have personalities and lives, and they are bonded to the crew and the captain of that ship. Very, very similar thing. So the two different relationships with dragons are fascinating, and this is part of the genius of this book. The Priory of the Orange Tree is one of the great fantasy novels. I'm not finished with it. It is not a series, it is a standalone novel, and I don't care that I haven't finished it. I know this is one of the great fantasy novels. This is absolutely now one of my favourite fantasy novels. When I talk about fantasy, I will talk about Robin Hobb, Joe Abercrombie, and this fucking book. That's fantasy to me. Alright, now let's talk about The Rage of Dragons. The Rage of Dragons manages to at once be far simpler and also far more complex than The Priory of the Orange Tree. I don't want to compare these two books, that's not why I'm doing this video, but it's kind of difficult because I'm reading them at the same time. That was my choice. They're both about dragons, and they both were published within the last, 3 years. And also, they are both bucking white, straight, cisgender tropes. The Priory of the Orange Tree is really, really feminist. It is about matriarchal society. Almost every protagonist, every main character in Priory of the Orange Tree is either a woman or queer, or both. It's a very queer book. It is a very woman-centric book, and, well, as a queer person, that's part of why I love it so much. This book does something similar, but rather than focusing on gender and sexuality by doing something different, it's focusing on race. Evan Winter is a British-born Canadian black writer whose parents are South American and he grew up in Africa. I think I got all of that right. Apologies if I didn't. And so his focus, as he mentions in his kind of bio, is that he wanted to write in black characters and black stories into the world of fantasy, because growing up he loved reading fantasy, but he never saw himself reflected in that. Fantasy has always been a very white place. And so Evan Winter is here to upend that a little bit, and I am thrilled. So now we have more queerness and more women in fantasy, and we have more racial diversity. That alone makes it a worthwhile read. Luckily, it's also a really fantastic fantasy novel as well. Now, I got this book as part of a subscription box, and I didn't really give it any attention at first until the Time magazine list of 100 best fantasy novels of all time came out, and this was on it. And I thought, wow, this book is like 2 years old. How did this happen? That's amazing. So, give it a go. That list, I didn't agree with everything on it, and I'm pretty sure Robin Hobb didn't make it at all, and she's my favourite fantasy writer, so fuck that list. But also, don't fuck that list, because this book is amazing, and without that list I wouldn't have picked it up, I don't think, even though I had it. I just looked at the cover, which is ugly as hell, and didn't want to read it. I know, that's a sin. Don't judge a book by its cover. We all do. Look at Priory of the Orange Tree. So what's it about? As I said, this book is at once more complicated and less complicated than Priory of the Orange Tree, and that is because the first 100 pages, which is a prologue and the first 3 chapters, isn't very good. It is messy and overly complex. It is full of really awkward world-building exposition. Evan Winter seems almost paranoid at the beginning that we follow and understand all of the language and the setting and the history that makes up this book. And of course, language, setting and history make up a huge part of any fantasy story. Fantasy writers are obsessed with unique language, unique lore, and unique setting and world building, and he prioritizes that far too much at the beginning. As soon as you get 100 pages in and you turn to chapter 4, the book really begins. It streamlines everything to make it much, much clearer and easier to follow, and it focuses in on our main protagonist, whose story, once it gets going, is very clear, easy to follow, and intensely, invigoratingly fun. The story of the Rage of Dragons follows a man called Tau. At the beginning, in the prologue, a queen has come onto the shore of this place that is full of savages, and they're fighting the savages. And this prologue is confusing as hell because it throws in so many words that you will not understand. If you do decide to read The Rage of Dragons, do not be put off by the fact that you cannot keep track of all of these strange words that are being thrown around. Sometimes the words are a class or a group of people. Sometimes it's a title. They're the book's version of general or captain. Sometimes it's the name of a character. Sometimes it's something else entirely. And it gets so baffling to tell the difference between the class of person, the title of a person, or the name of a person. And it takes 100 pages for you to get to grips with it, but it just comes. So if you feel a little bit lost in the first 100 pages, just keep going. It doesn't matter. It does all become clear. But at the beginning, we have a queen who has arrived on the shores of a place. She's been chased. Her people have been culled, and they arrive and they fight the natives in an attempt to build a city and set up their place. Then we jump forward a long, long time to Tau. Tau is a young man. He is a lesser. It's a book that is obsessed with class and hierarchies, and he is lesser. Tau is a fantastic character if you love Star Wars and also hate Star Wars. The reason being that Tau is Anakin Skywalker without the Jesus allegory or the midichlorians. He is a nobody who was born into a lower class, who was born without any luck, without any leg up, and yet we are following his story as he rises and becomes stronger and finds a will and a destiny of his own. He's also, in that regard, like Rey. If Rian Johnson's origin story for Rey had been kept in, which of course it should, and I'm not going to go on a Star Wars rant here, even though every video I make could be a Star Wars rant, even if it's a video about Wolf Hall. Rey's origin story should have been kept that she was a nobody, and instead it was destroyed by Disney because they were cowards. We know this. And it feels, when you read this, like Evan Winter appreciated the fact that Rey should have been a nobody because that's a far more interesting story, and so he gave us a nobody. He gave us Tau, a person who really came from nothing. And we have to follow the story of this random person who is full of enough piss and vinegar to make his story compelling. At the beginning of Tau's story, there is a raid on his town, and they fight back. It's not that interesting. Moving forward, Tau and his friends are going to become warriors, and so they're moving towards an exam and training to become warriors. Still not that interesting. And then we start chapter 4, and chapter 4, Tau suffers a deep personal loss, and that deep personal loss leads him on a tale of revenge. It feels a lot like Arya Stark with her list of people that she wants to kill one by one. Tao has a list. I'm not going to tell you why he has this list, but it's this list, and what he chooses to do following on from making that list, that becomes such a compelling narrative for us to follow. So The Rage of Dragons begins in a very, very sloppy and awkward manner, but it slowly becomes a very narrowly focused, clear and engaging narrative to follow that it should have been like that from the start. It trips over at the beginning of the race, only to then find its pace, find its rhythm, and become a really fantastic, streamlined and clear-cut fantasy narrative. The Rage of Dragons is fantastic. I did make a point at the beginning of the video talking about dragons taking over. The Rage of Dragons doesn't actually play a huge part. The Rage of Dragons, by the way, the term Rage of Dragons does have a specific meaning in the book. The word rage in this title does have a meaning that I won't go into, but the dragons themselves are actually a really kind of a background thing, at least at the beginning, and you see dragons right at the very start in the prologue, and then you don't really see them again for a while. It is about Tao and his story, and at the back of the book, they tried to sell it by saying that it's like Gladiator meets Game of Thrones. And actually, that isn't a bad comparison. It does feel like Gladiator. It is a man who has so much taken away from him, only to fight and go through trials and go through wars and battles to get his revenge. It really is a lot like Gladiator, and I absolutely adore it. And his story again feels like Anakin or Rey if their story had been done better. Perhaps the best thing about this book is the simplicity of it once it finds that simplicity, but it's also the fact that this is a book that is full of really great fight scenes. This is an aggressive and visceral book. It is a book where chapter after chapter, it's just fight scenes, and those fight scenes are really fantastic. It is a book that is visceral and engaging, and it has a physicality to it. It's kind of like an action film where there is a very, very clear narrative plot, a very clear world that has been built around it, but in the center of it all is a series of really engaging and exciting action scenes and fight scenes. It is a brutal book, and the description of those fight scenes carries it completely. Evan Winter is a very descriptive writer, and he's damn good at it. So what I have here are two of the best fantasy books of the last few years. This in particular is my new favorite fantasy novel. Both of them are worth reading. Both of them represent the return of dragons to fantasy, and I am absolutely ecstatic. I have come back into fantasy after sleeping on it for a little while, and this is what I found. It's very exciting stuff. These are incredible novels, and I urge you to read both of them. They are what fantasy needed. They are diversity. They are queer. They are exciting, new, bold fantasy novels, and you need to read them both. All right, subscribe for books.